My name is Anneke Scott and I'm the principal horn player of the Dunedin Consort, who have asked me to say a few words about specifically the Quoniam from the Bach Mass in B minor. And I just thought it'd be good for me to bring up 5 tips I have about playing this spectacular piece. Hopefully this will be useful both for horn players who are looking for approaches to this work, but also I hope it gives some insight into what we kind of do when we're playing this piece for a more general audience. The first tip, or the first practicality, is we have to discuss what is a Baroque horn, and we have different approaches to this right at the moment, which I find very exciting. As you can see, this is one of my Baroque horns. It's got a rather nice painted bell, and it's not that different from, here's a hunting horn I've got. And when this instrument, when the Baroque horn first got going around the early 18th century and in the 1730s when Bach was writing for it in the B minor Mass, it was quite new in the musical world. It was quite new, having been brought into the orchestra. And today we still have a lot of questions about exactly what it was and how it was played. And this means that today there are 3 differing approaches. And when I'm booked to play the Quoniam, one of the first things I do is just check in and see whether there's any strong feeling as to which approach an ensemble or director might want me to take. So the issue that we have, in a nutshell, is that this instrument depends on the series of notes which we call the harmonic series. And as you can hear at the top, I've almost got a scale. And lower down, there are gaps. It's more triadic. So this is why Baroque composers either wrote very high horn parts, because that's where you can get close things to melody, or we have a lot of arpeggios, kind of fanfares and things like this. The problem we have is that some of the notes aren't very in tune. Especially that 4th one, I can play it either as an F or an F sharp. Today, the 3 approaches, broadly speaking, are I could use my hand, I could put my hand into the bell of the instrument, but this affects the timbre of the instrument. Immediately it's slightly darker, it's not quite as bright. And what I'm doing is I'm putting my hand further into the bell of the instrument to correct these out of tune harmonics. This approach was very popular when the early music revival happened in the mid-20th century, and a lot of horn players at that time used that approach. I feel it really is a later technique than what Bach and his horn players would have known, and especially when we start to look at the horn parts in comparison to the trumpet parts, and trumpets didn't really have this later hand technique. And when we start to look at the pictures of horn playing at the time, I really think it's inappropriate for Bach, but it's an approach that's used in a lot of places, and so for certain ensembles I'm happy to use it. The next approach that came with the early music revival was horn builders in the 1970s started to add these holes, and these holes mean I can correct the out of tune harmonics. Problem is, it's not at all authentic. However, it is very practical, and quite often I will take the approach of I will use minimal holes. I will try and use as few as possible. It's possible to correct a lot of notes and then you start opening more and more holes. I tend just to try and correct the F and the A. The F sharp is possible to do with the embouchure by pulling the G down, so I try and use as little as possible, especially if you've got a running passage. It's really easy to do without, but if you've got something a bit more exposed, I might use a hole there. The final approach is to use neither hand technique nor holes. The Quoniam is a great piece to do this with, mainly because it's got such small forces, just the horn, the two bassoons, the basso continuo and the singer, which means when you've got fewer people, it's easier to have conversations about how we temper or tune things in order to accommodate some of these notes. The second tip I would have is agree a tempo beforehand if you can. One of the challenges with the Quoniam is quite often we're brought in very late in the rehearsal process. It's not unusual for me to be booked for literally the last 10 minutes of a rehearsal on the day. And this is another reason why I tend to choose to use minimal holes, because there is so little time to rehearse quite often. It's a really good idea, and it's a really friendly thing to try and get in touch with the singer that you are going to be partnered with beforehand and have some conversations about the tempo, because tempos can really fluctuate for this piece, and once you've started it, it can be very difficult to change it. And quite often you find people who may have been brought up with some of the slower tempos that were quite popular with this piece back in the 20th century. And it's just a good idea to have a few conversations about what your tempo is going to be. I also find that quite often you have to rethink things once you're in situ. We often play this piece in a boomy church acoustic, and it may well be that I quite like a fleet-footed tempo, but it quite often will be that the detail starts to get lost. So be flexible, but see if you can come to an idea about the tempo before you actually enter the rehearsal process. My third tip is learn it off by heart. It's not that long a piece. Be careful, because towards the end Bach brings back a lot of the material from the beginning, but he kind of puts it back together in a different way. The reason I strongly recommend doing this is not only do you learn the piece on a much deeper level when you learn it off by heart, but it's also a really practical thing to do. As I said earlier, we're quite often in the rehearsal quite late. It may well be that all your colleagues have gone on a tea break or they're grabbing dinner before the show, and it's not unusual for the space to change between that rehearsal and when you actually get to play it in concert. I have done concerts where when I've sidled up to do the Quoniam, the space I had earlier has completely disappeared. And if you are able to take out of the equation a music stand and music, it just makes you more resilient. Also, quite often not much time to rehearse. Because this instrument is so directional, it's really useful spending time during rehearsal making sure you're in the best position. And that might mean that you're having to try different spots. And if you don't have to cart a music stand around with you, it means you can be much more efficient and flexible in the rehearsal. My fourth tip is learn to dance a polonaise. There are so many links between this piece, the Bach B minor Mass, and Poland. Bach dedicated to August III of Poland, and it's worth exploring the Quoniam as a polonaise, and it's something which I think works really nicely. We quite often look at the influence of dance on Baroque repertoire. We look at how the rhythm or the dance steps, or even the rhetorical aspects of the dance, the symbolism of the dance, how that might bring information to us when we perform it. And I really think that the Quoniam fits in so nicely with this polonaise rhythm. It's worth thinking of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This 2-bar structure with this nudge on the second beat. So and also think of the bassoon line that goes along with that. Yeah, bum 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 ba da da dum ba da dum bum ba dum ba dum ba dum ba da 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 dum ba da. 1 2 3 1 da 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 1 2 3 1 da 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 da. And if you can get that groove going of the 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, that really sets a nice dancey groove to the whole of the Quoniam. My 5th and final tip for playing the Quoniam is learn to sit back and enjoy it, especially the first 3 movements that make up the Kyrie. I always just put my horn on the floor and sit back and listen for those 3 movements. And I always like to be on stage throughout at least the first half of the B minor Mass. Part of the reason for this is that whenever I've had to come on specially for the Quoniam, so maybe there's not been much room on stage and I've been in the wings and come on just for that movement, it feels like you're joining a party halfway through, and it feels very difficult to get the same energy levels as everybody else. Everybody else has been working and working and working, and then you just sort of flit in, and it always feels like different energies at work. So I don't like doing it for that reason. But it's also what it symbolises of walking on stage and playing a solo, because it's not a solo, it's a chamber piece, it's a team effort. The bassoon parts in this piece are wonderful. I think it goes up to like the highest note on the bassoon, which is important given that the Quoniam text is "you are the most high." So I really like to be there from the very beginning. Put your horn down, don't play anything for the first 3 movements, and then once you're at the Kyrie and the trumpets come in, that's when you can start to play along with the trumpets. Learn all the trumpet parts, play along with the timpani. You really need to know what you're doing because you don't want to come crashing in at the wrong moment. But there's also lots of other little places. So, for example, there's a bit in the Laudamus Te where I quite often just play along with the strings for a bit. And this brings me to another thing about the actual spatial experience of playing it, which is you often end up sitting in a different place depending on how the layout of the orchestra is. And that's such a joy, because one time you might be sitting next to the violas and you'll find a viola line you can play along with, or next time you might be adjacent to the bassoons and you can find some bassoon lines to play along with, or you might be closer to the choir. So it's a really good way of getting to learn Bach's masterful orchestration in a really pragmatic way.